Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to tackle something pretty crucial in international finance, beneficial ownership regulations, or UBO regs, as they're often called.
That's right.
We're diving deep specifically into South America, focusing on 5 key players: Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. Think of this as like your crash course on how these countries are working to increase financial transparency.
Exactly. We're pulling our intel from a guide to global UBO regulations, a really comprehensive resource. Our mission today is to sift through all the dense info, pull out the most important bits, and highlight the key differences and challenges each country faces. We want you to walk away feeling like you've got a good handle on things without feeling overwhelmed.
Totally. So before we get lost in the weeds of each country's specific laws, let's just level set on what beneficial ownership even means.
Sounds good.
Basically, it's about figuring out who really owns and controls a company, like the actual living, breathing person or people, not just who's listed on paper, right? Sometimes those official shareholders are just stand-ins for someone else.
Right.
UBO is all about peeling back the layers and finding out who's pulling the strings, who's actually benefiting financially.
Yeah, and it's always a natural person, like a human being we're talking about.
Always a human?
Yeah.
Okay, so why is all this so important? Why bother with UBO transparency?
Well, it's a huge EE tool in the fight against, financial crime. Money laundering, corruption, tax evasion, all that nasty stuff.
Right.
When you know who really owns the companies involved, it's way harder to hide behind all these complicated structures. Makes it harder to get away with those crimes.
Okay, so let's get specific here. First stop on our South America tour, Brazil. What's the UBO situation like there?
So Brazil's been making some moves to get in line with international anti-money laundering, or AML, standards. They haven't yet established a fully centralized database for persons with significant control, or PSC, across the board. But they do require businesses to report anyone who holds 25% or more of a company's shares or voting rights.
So a quarter ownership.
Exactly. That info goes directly to the Brazilian Securities Commission.
Okay. Now, trusts often pop up in these discussions about ownership. What's Brazil's stance on those?
Good point. Our guide highlights that trusts, particularly those in the financial and real estate sectors, also have to disclose their beneficial owners, especially important in those industries.
Makes sense. And is there a central registry in Brazil where all this ownership data is stored?
Yep. It's called the National Register of Legal Persons, or CNPJ.
CNPJ, got it.
It was set up in 2017 and falls under the Brazilian Federal Revenue Service, the RFB. Access is granted to registrars and to competent authorities.
Okay, so they've got the framework in place, but what are some of the biggest hurdles Brazil is facing in really making this UBO system effective?
Well, one major challenge is just, actually enforcing the rules they've got, making sure companies are actually complying. Then there's the fact that they still lack that fully centralized UBO database we talked about.
Yeah.
The absence of a fully implemented PSC register across all sectors poses a challenge as well.
Right.
And they also don't have a specific register for overseas entities that might own parts of Brazilian companies.
So foreign ownership could be a bit of a blind spot then.
Yeah, it's a potential weak point. And it's important to note that 25% ownership trigger. Someone could theoretically spread their ownership across different companies or sectors to stay under that radar.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears down to Argentina. What's the story there?
Argentina has its own regulatory framework under their anti-money laundering law. Similar to Brazil, companies have to reveal who owns them. The threshold is the same too. Individuals with 25% or more of shares or voting rights. Trusts are also on the hook for reporting their beneficial owners.
Okay, sounds pretty similar so far. Do they have a central registry like Brazil's CNTJ?
They do. It's managed by the National Tax Administration, AFIP, and called, the AFIP Registro, creatively enough.
Right.
This one's a bit newer, launched in 2020.
Okay.
But there's a catch. Access is currently limited to the registrar.
So not as much transparency there, it seems.
Yeah.
What other challenges is Argentina facing with UBO regulations?
Well, for one, they also don't have that central public register specifically for beneficial ownership.
Okay.
And no dedicated PSC register either.
Got it.
And no specific way to track ownership from entities based overseas. Like Brazil, they're missing that piece. And enforcing those AML regulations, especially when you're dealing with those really complex ownership structures, it's a constant struggle. So the lack of those central registers and the limited access, it all adds up to, limited transparency.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right, let's move north now to Colombia. How are they approaching UBO transparency?
Colombia also requires companies to come clean about their beneficial owners. It's all part of their AML efforts. But here's where things get a little different.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Colombia has a much lower threshold for what triggers that reporting requirement. Individuals holding just 5% or more of shares or voting rights have to be disclosed.
Wow, 5%. That's a big difference from the 25% we've seen so far.
It is. Suggests they're casting a much wider net.
Yeah. What about trusts?
Same deal. Trusts have to report beneficial ownership.
All right, and what about their registry?
They have the Colombia Single Registry of Beneficial Owners, or RUB, managed by their Tax and Customs Authority, DIN. Launched in 2022, access is given to the registrar and competent authorities.
Okay, so another registry in place. But what challenges are they facing? Even with that lower threshold, there must be some hurdles.
Definitely. Even with that 5% rule, they still haven't set up a central or public register specifically for beneficial ownership. No dedicated PSC register either.
Okay.
And, like we've seen with the others, no system for tracking overseas entities.
Okay. Seeing a bit of a pattern here.
Yeah, and getting everyone on board, especially smaller businesses, making sure they're actually complying with the rules. That's another ongoing challenge. So, they've got this really strict threshold, which is great, but those missing registers really limit transparency.
Right, a mixed bag, it seems. Let's head further south now to Chile. What's their UBO framework like?
Chile's system seems to be, a bit more aligned with international standards.
Okay, good to hear.
They require disclosure of anyone holding 25% or more of shares or voting rights. That info gets filed with the Chilean Internal Revenue Service, the SII. And yep, you guessed it, trusts got to report their beneficial owners too.
Okay, so pretty standard so far. What about their registry?
This is where Chile takes a big step forward. They actually have a publicly accessible PSC register. This really boosts transparency when it comes to understanding who's behind Chilean companies.
Wow, a public register, that's a big deal.
It is. Their beneficial ownership register, Registro de Propietarios Reales in Spanish, is under the SII, launched just this year, 2023. It's open to the registrar, competent authorities, A&D obliged entities, meaning those businesses with AML responsibilities. However, they're still missing a register for overseas entities.
Right, so that loophole remains.
Yeah, but overall, that public access to the PSC register, it's huge for accountability. Makes it much harder to hide shady dealings.
Definitely a step in the right direction. All right, last but not least, let's talk about Peru. What's their UBO landscape like?
Peru also mandates beneficial ownership disclosure under their AML regulations. That 25% or more ownership is the trigger there, too. And as with the others, trusts have to report their beneficial owners.
Okay, and how about their registry system?
Their Tax and Customs Authority, CNAT, manages the Beneficial Owners Register, or Registro de Beneficiarios Finales. It went live in 2019.
Okay.
Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Our guide says that this registry is accessible to the public.
Cool. So another public registry.
Well, sorta. There's a nuance here.
Right, I'm listening.
While the registry itself is technically open to the public, Peru doesn't actually make the specific beneficial ownership information readily available.
Ah, okay.
And they also lack a centralized PSC register.
Got it.
And, like many of the others, no register for overseas entities. So, you could technically access the registry, but it's not a guarantee you'll find the info you're looking for.
So a bit of a facade of transparency, you could say?
Yeah, it's a bit misleading.
Okay. So, given all that, what are the main challenges Peru faces in strengthening its UBO framework?
Enforcement is a big one, especially when it comes to companies with those super complex ownership structures.
Right.
And then there's the lack of that centralized PSC register and the absence of a register for overseas entities. Those are major roadblocks.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. It's clear that South America is making progress on UBO transparency, but there's a lot of variation in their approaches. So, big picture, what are the key takeaways you want listeners to walk away with?
Well, it's definitely a mixed bag. Some countries, like Chile, are really leading the charge with that public PSC register. Others are still playing catch-up, trying to get those centralized systems up and running.
And it seems like they're all wrestling with some common challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Enforcement, dealing with those complicated ownership structures, figuring out how to track overseas entities. These are issues that pop up again and again.
Yeah. And, those different thresholds for reporting beneficial ownership, like Colombia's 5% versus everyone else's 25%.
Right, right.
That really shows how their approaches can vary.
Exactly. Colombia is casting a much wider net, which could lead to uncovering more instances of hidden control.
And then there's the whole issue of access to this information.
Yeah, we've seen a real spectrum there. Chile's leading the way with public access to their PSC register. Peru and Brazil have publicly accessible registries, but the actual beneficial ownership data you can get from them is, well, it varies. Argentina's got the most restricted access right now.
Right. So the bottom line is this. South American countries are working towards UBO transparency, but they're all on their own paths, at their own pace. It makes for a pretty complex landscape for anyone involved in international business or financial oversight in the region.
Absolutely. And this raises a really important question for all our listeners out there. Think about the implications of these varying levels of transparency. What does it mean for the global fight against financial crime? What does it mean for promoting good governance? When a country decides to be more open about who really owns and controls the companies within its borders, what ripple effects does that have? And what other questions does this spark for you about the future of international finance and regulations?
Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, everyone.
Thanks for having me.